Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our talk about skilled migration to Australia. My name is James, and I'm the registered migration agent and owner of ANZ Migration, and I'll be the one presenting today about skilled migration. Let's get started with the presentation. Just a couple of points. Information here is general, and information does change sometimes quite quickly. So always check any information before you make an application. Don't just base it upon information presented today. And the other thing is that I will answer questions at the end of the seminar. So if you have any questions, do keep those until the end of the seminar. You can quite welcome to type them on the screen at the bottom in the Ask Questions section, but I won't be going through those questions until we get to the end of the seminar. So any questions I'm happy to cover then. So you can raise them earlier, but do understand I won't answer them during the presentation. I'll actually cover all those questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's get started and we'll get straight into it. Okay. So, got some cute koalas there. Okay, so we'll get straight into the presentation. Now, Nstead Migration, which is our company in Singapore, we were previously known as Australia Migration Agency and separately New Zealand Migration Agency. It's a bit of a mouthful to be managing two long company names, so we simplified it to ANZ Migration. We've been operating in Singapore since the year 2003, so we're very established in Singapore. And we only do migration to Australia and New Zealand. Now, I think that's very important to emphasize because we're only registered and licensed to provide immigration advice to these countries. And we only do services where we're qualified and registered and licensed appropriately to provide those services. And that's important because there are a lot of companies in Singapore that provide immigration to all kinds of countries, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And I'd probably say in the majority of cases, these companies aren't actually qualified and licensed to be providing that advice because the Singapore government doesn't regulate this industry in any way. So I'm regulated from both the Australia side for Australian applications and from the New Zealand side for New Zealand applications. So it makes sure that you are dealing with someone that's appropriately qualified and licensed to be doing the work they're doing. Now, we're based in the city. Here's a map showing where we are. We're right opposite Singapore Parliament, so midway between closest MRT would be Clarke Quay MRT, but also a short walk from the City Hall MRT. So quite central location, which makes it very easy if you need to drop any documents off to our office. Now, my name is James. I'm the owner and director of the company. As I mentioned before, I'm a registered migration agent for Australia and a licensed immigration advisor for New Zealand. So I'm qualified for both countries. We use different terminology. Australia uses registered, New Zealand uses licensed, but they're essentially the same thing. And this means that I meet the requirements, and these are my licenses are renewed every year, meet the ongoing requirements to maintain my registration to operate in this industry. Now, I've been doing immigration for 12 years in Singapore, so I started in 2003. And in terms of my own background, before I got into immigration, I was in the IT industry as a PMP certified project manager. So that's my own background, but I've been doing immigration now for the last 12 years. Now, one thing you want to check when you're dealing with a person is to make sure they really are a registered migration agent. Now, unfortunately, we've come across cases in Singapore where people basically pretend to be registered migration agents when they're not. Another common tactic is a company will display a registration number, but they don't actually make it clear who that registration number belongs to. Registration numbers don't belong to a company. They belong to an individual person because it's that person that's qualified and meets all the requirements to provide immigration advice. So always make sure you are dealing with a registered migration agent. And one of the ways is when you're meeting with a registered agent, you will see the certificate on display in their office. It's an absolute must. There's no negotiation here. If you don't see the certificate on display with the name and photo of the person, then that person is not a registered migration agent because it's a mandatory requirement. This is always on display in any of our meeting rooms where we meet clients. So do check that. You don't have to ask to see this if it's not there, or someone else is in the room, but it's not the person on the certificate, then you know you're not dealing with a registered migration agent. And one of the rules is that a registered migration agent cannot allow anyone else in the company who's a non-registered migration agent to provide advice. So you can't get advice from a person who's not a registered migration agent. So when you're dealing with us, you'll get advice from either myself or my colleague Wilson, and we are both registered migration agents for Australia. Now, another useful thing is the agent number, and you can see that here. The agent number is a 6-digit number. Now, the first 2 digits of the agent's number tell you the year the agent was first registered. In my case, it's the year 2004. I started practicing in 2003, and I got my registration in the year 2004. So my number starts with 04, and then it's 28740. So you know straight away, I've been a registered agent since 2004, which means I've been a registered agent for 11 years now. So it's a very quick gauge to the level of experience of that agent. The other thing, of course, is you can see the validity of the certificate to make sure it is valid. These are renewed every year, and we have to meet certain requirements to be able to renew this. So it makes sure that that agent is maintaining the standards expected of them. Now, these are the things I'm going to cover today. The focus will be on skilled migration because that's the main pathway we deal with for people migrating to Australia. But I will quickly touch upon some of the other options. I'm going to talk about the actual, some of the key points to the process, some of the key terms and what they mean. And then I'll talk about the actual process and the steps we go through. I'll then talk about keeping your PR once you're in Australia and a few other important bits of information. Now, before we get into the actual visa pathways, one thing I want to touch upon are the benefits for PRs in Australia. Now, from the Singapore environment and in many other countries, people expect a significant difference between the benefits available to a citizen and the benefits available to a PR. And in most countries, they are quite different because those countries want to encourage people to become citizens. Australia is a bit different in that the benefits available to a PR are essentially the same as citizens. There's a few minor differences, but most of the rights and benefits are actually the same between the two. The big difference is that PRs can't obviously get an Australian passport and they can't vote. And there's an interest-free study loan available to citizens, but not available to PRs. So they're the main differences. The other rights and benefits are essentially the same for both. So that's a great, well, gives you a great sense of security because you're not discriminated against because you're a PR. Now, these benefits include things like Medicare, which is a free public healthcare system, very significant. That means that essentially your public hospital costs in Australia, your public healthcare costs are paid for by the government. It's not insurance, it is an entitlement, it's a benefit available to you. We have a wide range of social security, and these basically are welfare payments that are available to you in times of need. So it includes things like unemployment benefits, age pensions, disability pensions, and so on. As an example, if you became disabled and couldn't work anymore, the government would actually give you a pension for the rest of your life to be able to support yourself, pay your bills, pay your rent, and so on. Similarly with unemployment, if you lose your job and become unemployed, the government will give you payments until you find another job so you can pay your rent and bills and so on and support yourself and your family. Now, I do have to point out that these benefits do have a waiting period for new migrants, and the waiting period is 2 years of residence in Australia. Previously, the government would give these straight away to new migrants. And of course, if you come to Australia, you don't have a job yet, and you get money from the government every week, there's less incentive for you to go out and actually find work. So the government decided, well, we want people to look for work. We want them to contribute to the economy, ideally. So we'll put a waiting period in of 2 years for these benefits for new migrants. But the other benefits don't have waiting periods. Free education in schools, so public schools are free. Australian rates at university. This is a very significant benefit because it means that if you go to university in Australia as a PR, you pay the same rates that an Australian citizen would pay. And that's significantly cheaper than studying in Australia as an overseas student. We have a wide range of payments to support families, as the government recognises that raising children is expensive. So the government has a lot of payments to assist families with the costs of raising children. And they include things like paid parental leave, which is a scheme that basically gives either the mother or the father 18 weeks, which is 4.5 months of paid leave when they have a new child. Now, as I said, these other benefits, there are no waiting periods for these, so you can apply for these immediately when you move to Australia. The Medicaid scheme, which is the healthcare scheme I just mentioned, provides free public healthcare, and it does subsidise non-public healthcare services, so it ensures that they are lower in cost. It's not insurance, and there are no fees for this, so it is an entitlement you have as a PR in Australia. So it's a fantastic benefit that really ensures that everyone can access healthcare services in Australia. For the family payments, and these are the payments for families with children, I thought the easiest way would be to give an example of what sort of payments you can get under this. So I've got a simple case study here, an analyst programmer living in a house in Melbourne with 3 children. Now, average salary for a programmer in Melbourne is about $107,000 per year. Average rent is just under $400 per week for an average house in Melbourne. And in this sort of scenario, this family would actually get almost $450 every 2 weeks from the government as a benefit. It's not a loan, it is an entitlement. And as I said before, there's no waiting period for this, so you can apply for this immediately when you move to Australia, provided, of course, the children are with you in Australia, because it is designed to help you with the costs of raising children. Okay, so we're going to talk about pathways. Now, before I get into skilled migration, I'll just quickly touch upon a few of the other pathways. There are actually several hundred different visa types for Australia, but I'll just touch upon a few of the more common ones that we see. And first, on the business investment side, if you are looking at investment as a pathway for migration to Australia, the minimum amount we're looking at is 1.5 million Australian dollars that you have available to invest in Australia. We also have retirement pathways, but retirement are designed for people that are financially well off and able to support themselves, because retirement doesn't give you a PR, it gives you an ongoing temporary visa. So the person has to be able to support themselves, and so the government wants them to make an investment to show that they have that available money. And there are business pathways where you can be a business owner and use that to migrate to Australia. To do that, your existing business has to have a turnover in excess of 500,000. Or the equivalent of. So it doesn't have to be in Australia, it can be overseas, but you're looking at the equivalent turnover of 500,000 per year. Now, that's one of the things about business migration to Australia. A lot of people will come to me and say, James, I want to migrate to Australia and open a business. You know, it's my dream to open a cafe or a bed and breakfast or some other business in Australia. And that's great. But if you want to use a business pathway to do that, you have to already own a business. It's not enough that you want to open a business in Australia. You have to already have business experience in managing and owning a business to actually use that. We also have family-based migration. So this includes more commonly parents. So you migrate to Australia and later you want to sponsor your parents to migrate to Australia. There are options for that, although there are some tricky aspects to that. So it can be quite complicated, or even in some cases quite expensive with the government fees for that. And we also have partners of Australian citizens or PRs. This is more common where you're single when you apply for the PR, and later on you get married or you've got a partner and you want to sponsor that partner to come to Australia. There are pathways to actually do that. And then skilled migration. And as I mentioned before, skilled migration will be the focus of the talk today. The interesting thing about skilled migration is it allows you to migrate to Australia without obtaining employment. So it's not dependent upon any employment offer in Australia. You're actually migrating based upon your background, based upon your skills, your experience, and so on, and able to use that to get PR to go to Australia. Another thing is, because you're getting a full PR and landing in Australia already holding the PR, you have a lot of flexibility in what you do when you get down there. If you don't want to work, you don't have to. If you want to open a business, you can do so. If you want to go and study, you can do that. If you just want to sit on the beach and surf all day and live a retired life, you can do that. So it's not putting any conditions upon that PR you get in Australia. It's a full PR from the beginning without requiring any job offer in Australia. So quite different to countries like Singapore, where the expected pathway is that you'd actually get some kind of work visa first, like an employment pass or an S pass or a work permit, and then later you move on to PR. So it's quite different in that aspect. Of course, there are employment-sponsored visas for Australia, but they are generally temporary visas. And one of the difficulties is that unlike countries like Singapore, an Australian company has to show they've made significant efforts to hire someone locally in Australia first, and they actually have to they have to show that they pay that person a high salary, which is at least equivalent to the local salary in Australia. So basically, they can't bring someone in from overseas and underpay them to save costs like many companies will actually do in Singapore. So Australia is very protective of people already in Australia. No matter whether they're a PR or citizen in Australia, they're equally protected by these kinds of initiatives. So we'll talk about some of the concepts in skilled migration first before we actually talk about the actual pathway and steps for the process. Now in Australia, the migration program follows the financial year in Australia, and that starts from July of each year and goes through to the end of June in the following year. So at the moment, we're getting towards the end of the current program year, and the new one will start on the 1st of July. Now, there's good and bad aspects to the start of a program year. The good is that quotas are reset. So planning levels, the numbers of places available for visas are at the maximum at the beginning of July because these are reset. I guess the negative aspect is that major changes tend to be introduced at the beginning of the program year. It's much easier to introduce a major change at the beginning of the program year rather than midstream. Now, there's no guarantee that it'll always be on the 1st of July, but it's much more likely. And the other thing is that when there are changes introduced, generally they become more difficult. If you think about it, the number of people worldwide is increasing every year. People are getting higher and higher qualifications each year and accumulating more work experience. And so the places available become much more competitive to actually obtain those places. There's a lot more competition in each year. So generally the requirements go up each year. And that brings me to one question which I often get asked, which is, James, should I go ahead and apply now or should I apply later? What do you think? And my answer to that is it's pretty much always the same, which is if you're eligible now, you should apply now, because more likely than not, your requirements in the future will be stricter and higher and more difficult to meet. So do keep that in mind. That's quite an important consideration for migration. And I guess probably migration to any country, but definitely towards Australia. Okay. Now, who can be included in the family unit? Well, we have several people that can be included. So when you make a skilled migration application to Australia, it can include your family. And we have a definition called the family unit of the people that can be included. And they, of course, include you as the main applicant, can include your spouse, and your spouse is someone that you can be married to or not married to. So basically, your spouse can be someone that you're married to, or if you're not married, if you can show that you've been living together for at least 12 months in a committed relationship, then you can actually include that person as your spouse. You can also include children, of course, and children can actually extend to adult children, provided though they are still studying and dependent upon you and single. So these are required to be met by any adult children that you want to include in the application. Now, there are some other criteria. So if you do have adult children, do check with me to make sure that they are likely to be eligible to be included in the application. But younger children, children under 18, no issue. They're still considered dependent children and can be included in the application. Actually, just one point I should make with the children. For those people that have children during NS, it is arguable whether children in NS, and this is, I'm talking children over 18, during NS would be eligible. So far, we've had no issues, and we've been able to argue that they should be included as dependent children. So if you have any child in that situation, let me know. But so far, I've been successful in getting those children included in the application, even though they're not studying. And we're basically saying to the government, well, they're doing NS, but they're not getting a proper salary. They're still largely dependent upon the family for support. And you can also include other relatives. We call these dependent relatives. Now, there's a few criteria that have to be met to include another relative in the family unit. And there's three key criteria that need to be met. We've got them here. First one is they must need to be single. So they could be divorced or separated or widowed. They must be usually living with a family, and they must be financially supported by the family. So we want to see here that they are basically living with you, supported by you, and they're single. They don't have any spouse to support them in any way. Now, the most common example would be a widowed mother. So your father's passed away, your mother is widowed, she moves in and lives with you. Very common in Singapore. And usually because she's elderly, she's retired and supported by you financially. So if there is a relative that you think meets this criteria, let me know. Give me some details in an email, and I'm very happy to go through and give you some advice on whether or not they're likely to be eligible to be included in the application. And of course, if they're included, then they're getting PR with you and the other family members and able to move to Australia. Now, a skilled migration application hinges upon one occupation that you specify in the application, and we call that the nominated occupation. So you must indicate one occupation, and only certain occupations are recognized for migration purposes. Now, we have two lists that are used that define the occupations that can be specified in an application. The first list is called the SOL. There's about 180 occupations on this list. And this list is of higher demand occupations. So the demand is higher for these occupations in Australia. And the government says because these occupations are in fairly high demand, all of the pathways available under skilled migration are available. There's no restrictions applied to any of these occupations. So it means all of the pathways available under this scheme are available to you. There's a second list called the CSOL. Now, it gets a bit confusing because the CSOL list published on the immigration website actually includes the SOL occupations as well. So what we're talking about here are occupations that are only on this list and not on the SOL. Now, if your occupation is only on this CSOL list, then the demand varies for that occupation. It means that it may not be in high demand throughout Australia. So the idea is these are lower demand occupations that are only on the CSOL list. And what the government says, we will only let you go through this process if, and only if, you get confirmation from one of the regions in Australia that your skills are needed in that part of Australia. So you're basically getting through because there's some acknowledgement that you're needed in Australia. Now, it doesn't require a job offer, but it does require that confirmation by one of the governments in Australia that your skills are needed. And that process of getting that confirmation is called nomination. Now, the various regions in Australia are the states and territories. There's a separate government for each of these states and territories. And that government must issue a confirmation that your skills are needed and they agree to support your application process. So this is mandatory if your occupation is on that second list and not on the higher demand list. Now, it's also important to understand, while this is mandatory and it's a necessary step for the process, it doesn't actually do anything else. It doesn't give you funding, it doesn't give you a job, and it doesn't even guarantee you'll get the visa. It just means this particular requirement has been met as part of the process, and that is a necessary requirement for that process when you've got a lower demand occupation. So it does mean there's an extra dependency in the process here on what those states and territories are looking for. Now, another important part of skilled migration is a skill assessment. And a skill assessment is where you get confirmation from an authority in Australia that you meet the requirements that have been set for that occupation for migration purposes. So each occupation has a designated authority in Australia, and the role of that authority for this process is to confirm that you meet any requirements set for that occupation. Now, it's important to note that industry requirements and these requirements can vary. So just because you're qualified to work in the industry doesn't necessarily mean you meet the requirements required for the skill assessment for your occupation. So they can vary. The other thing is when people see the word assessment, they tend to think exam. Now, majority, and I'd say 99% of the skill assessments we do don't require any kind of exam. They are based upon most part having certain qualifications and in some cases work experience. So it's basically a matter of submitting certain documents through to Australia, waiting for that authority to look at those documents and come back and say, yes, you're successfully assessed for that occupation. And these are some of the pathways available under the skill assessment process. I've listed some of the pathways for ICT professionals, and there's a few different pathways there, and the pathway for accountants. Okay, so under skilled migration, we deal with 3 visa types, and I'll go through these visa types now and explain the difference between them. The first one is skilled independent, and all of these visa subclasses, by the way, have a number, which is called the subclass number, and for independent, it's 189. So when people talk about this visa, they normally refer to it as a 189 visa. Now, independent is exactly as it suggests. It's independent. It's not dependent upon getting nomination by a state or territory, and it's not dependent upon any relative sponsorships. So you're going through independently, and that leads through to permanent residence in Australia. Nominated is similar to independent, except that there's an additional requirement to get state or territory nomination. And that's, as I said, where a region in Australia says, yes, your skills are needed, we agree to support the application, and they offer you nomination. And that leads through to permanent residence. So it's very similar to independent, except that there's an extra step, getting that state or territory nomination. And as I said before, that's required for some occupations to actually get through the process successfully. And there's a third option. Now, the third option is quite interesting because it's a little bit different. It is regional sponsored, that's the name of it, and it's a 489 visa. Now, there are 2 options for the requirements here. One is to get state or territory nomination. So again, that region saying your skills are needed, or going through with a relative in Australia sponsoring your application. So you can use either of these, but you must choose one of these. And it's interesting because it doesn't go directly to PR. It's actually a 2-stage process. And the first stage gives you a temporary visa that lets you live and work in Australia. And later on, you move on to the permanent residency. Now, obviously, we try and go for a full PR, direct PR where possible, but in some cases, people may not be eligible for that, and this may be the option they're eligible for. This is not a bad option because it gets you into Australia, it allows you to live and work there. The only drawback is you've got a delay before you actually get the full permanent residency. I'll talk a bit more about this visa and the steps involved a little bit later. Another important part of the skilled migration system is the points test. And under the points test, you're allocated points for different factors. And you need to score the minimum threshold of 60 points. In some cases, you might need more points depending upon the pathway that you're looking at. Now, I haven't listed every option to get points on the screen. I've just listed some of the main areas that people will look at for getting points. The other thing I want to point out here is that the points test is just one of many requirements. I've seen people that have made a very serious mistake by looking at the points test, adding up their points and thinking, yes, I've got enough points, therefore I'm eligible for the visa. There's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot of other requirements. And every single requirement in the application process must be met. If you miss one requirement, then the application fails. So just keep that in mind. The points test, like every other requirement, is important, but it tends to get too much visibility, and people tend to think this is the key requirement or the main requirement. Every requirement is a key requirement. So just be aware of that and be very careful. Now, the way the points test works, you get points for different factors, and we look at age, for example. You'll see the various age ranges here and a certain number of points that are allocated for each age group. Now, the prime age group, to give you the maximum points, is 25 to 32. Once you hit 33, you'll drop points. You drop by 5 points. When you hit 40, you'll drop by another 10 points. So that's a cumulative 15 points that you've lost. And when you hit 45, you drop by 15 points, which is a cumulative 30 points lost. So actually the loss of points at each age group increases. And that means that age boundaries like 33, 40, 45 become very, very significant because they have a major impact on the application. Now, I talked before about the different pathways, and there are some points available for some of the different pathways. So independent has no additional points, but nominated, so this is where you get the state or territory nomination for the PR pathway, that will actually give you an extra 5 points. So getting that nomination for a PR gives you an extra 5 points. Now, I said before the threshold is 60 points. So if you were at 55 points, and in fact, you may normally be looking at this independent visa, but if you've got 55 points, you don't have enough points. You need to get to 60. So you might drop down to the nominated pathway and get the nomination. That would give you an extra 5 points and bring you up to the required 60 points to allow you to continue with the process. The third option, which is that two-stage pathway, the one that first has a temporary visa and then later on a PR. This is interesting because if you get state nomination or relative sponsorship for this option, for the TR pathway, you actually get a bonus of 10 points towards the application. So if you're at 50 points, this can give you the extra 10 points you need to get to the minimum of 60. And we do sometimes have clients that revert to this pathway because they may be going for, let's say, independent, but not able to get a good enough score on the English language test to get the points. And so they drop down to a pathway like this that still gets them into Australia, still lets them live and work there, but compensates for the lack of points on the English language exam by getting the nomination for this pathway. Now, of course, that would depend upon your particular circumstances, but we have used that in this situation before where clients can't get the required English language score. Now, as I said before, this pathway is first temporary residence followed by permanent residency. And the way this works, the temporary visa is valid for up to 4 years, and the requirements to move from the temporary visa to the permanent visa are quite straightforward. You have to live in Australia for at least 2 years, and you have to work for at least 1 year full-time. So it can be any occupation in Australia before you then can move on to the full PR. So live there for 2 years, work for at least 1 year, and you can move on to the full PR. Now, that work can be any occupation. So it doesn't have to be related to the original occupation that was specified in the application. And another interesting thing is this can be completed by your spouse. So you might be the person who meets the requirements to get the first temporary visa for the first 4 years. And you might think, well, my job's really good. I don't want to move just yet. It might be your spouse that then goes down to Australia, meets the requirement to live there for 2 years, work there for 1 year, and get the full PR. And when you apply for that full PR, just like the first stage, it's a family application. So you can include your spouse, even if they are living overseas, in that application. If you are looking at using a relative to sponsor you for this, be aware that it is up to a cousin or grandparent or closer. So quite far for relatives. And they must be living in certain areas of Australia. Currently, that excludes Sydney and Brisbane, but most other areas in Australia are considered for this. Now, another important part of the points test is an English language exam. Now, one of the questions I often get asked is, James, do I really have to do an English language exam? You know, I speak English, my schooling's in English, I've done all my study in English. Do I really have to do this exam? And the short answer is yes. Basically, if you want to claim any points for English language ability, then you must do the English language exam. Even if you had a PhD in English language and you are from England and you only speak English, you would still have to do the English language exam if you want to claim any points for your English language ability. So the Australian government has become very, very strict with this. Now, there are 4 parts to the IELTS, which is the main English language exam we use. They're called bands, and we have reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Each of these is graded from 0 to 9, 9 being the highest score, 0 being the lowest. Now, when we talk about scores required on this exam, for example, if we say you need an IELTS of 7 for skilled migration, we're talking about getting a 7 or higher on each of these 4 sections. So it's not the average score we're talking about, it is the individual score, and nothing must be below 7 if we say you need a 7 on the IELTS test. And you can see the points awarded here for the various bands on the IELTS test. So IELTS of 6 is the minimum, but doesn't give you any points. IELTS of 7 will give you 10 points, and IELTS of 8 will give you 20 points. Now, IELTS of 8 is quite difficult. Around 3% of our clients, I'd say, would get an IELTS of 8. So it is difficult, it's possible, but it is quite difficult. So you need to be very confident of your English language ability if you're targeting an IELTS of 8. IELTS of 7, a majority of our clients would be able to get that, but it's certainly something you want to prepare for and not take lightly. And IELTS of 6, I would say almost all of our clients would actually get an IELTS of 6 in each band. It's quite rare to see someone who can't get IELTS of 6. And these are the average scores. So these are not our clients, these are across the board, the average scores that Singaporeans get on the IELTS test, just to give you an idea of the level that people would achieve on average for the IELTS test. Okay, from November last year, the Australian government has introduced a few alternative tests, and they include TOEFL IBT. So that's quite interesting. So the TOEFL IBT, and there's a few other tests as well, but that would be the main one. So TOEFL is generally used in the US, and that can be used now as an alternative to the IELTS test. Another point that you will get points for on the points test is your qualification. And this could also be important for other things like the skill assessment that requires certain qualifications. Now, this is the scale of qualifications in the education system in Australia for higher education, starting from certificate level, going right up. We've got diploma, then your bachelor degree, and right up to a doctoral degree, the highest level. Now, the question for the Australian government is, your overseas qualification, where does that fit on this scale? It's not as simple as you've got a certificate that says bachelor degree, and therefore it's regarded as a bachelor degree in Australia. You think about it, every country has its own education system, these vary in complexity and structure, and there are quite significant differences. For example, we may have someone that has a bachelor degree that takes 3 years of study in Singapore. We might have someone that has the same bachelor degree that takes 5 years of study in Philippines, that also takes 3 years of study in India. Or you may have someone doing a bachelor degree in India at one campus that is actually in some little college in some backwater area of some state that doesn't have the same facilities and same quality of teaching staff as a main campus for that university. And yet both degree awards look the same. It's just the location of study is different. So there can be significant differences. In fact, the Australian government does an in-depth study of the education systems in each country. And you can see here, this is a chart showing the Singapore education system. This is the Australian education system. So you can see there's quite a lot of differences just between these two countries alone in terms of the education structure, options, and pathways available. So the government basically has to work out a way to match what's here with what's here. And there's actually a reference database we can use for this. Unfortunately, it's not publicly available. Well, I should say it's not publicly freely available. It can be accessed, but you have to pay a subscription fee for that. It's quite expensive. But it's something we subscribe to because we need to be able to check the database, check the reference information to work out the equivalence of qualifications. So we're able to do that as part of the assessment. And depending upon the outcome of your qualification assessment, these are the points you can be looking at. So certificate or diploma, at least 10 points. Bachelor degree, 15 points, and having a doctoral degree, 20 points. So if you've got a master's, that alone won't change your points. You would still be at the bachelor level of 15 points. So to move up from 15 to 20, you do have to have a doctoral degree. Now, work experience also gets you points. We do look at work experience during the last 10 years for points. And the different levels are 3 years, 5 years, and 8 years for a different number of points. So obviously we want to try and get as much work experience demonstrated as possible during the last 10 years. Now, skilled, and I put that in bold, is quite important. First of all, the work experience must be related to your nominated occupation. So the occupation you indicate in the application, we only look at work experience that's relevant to that occupation. and it must be what's called skilled. And the Australian government's got quite a complex process to define what is skilled. I'll try and explain how we look at it here. So I'm going to use as an example a mechanical engineer. And we've got a definition the Australian government uses as a broad definition for a mechanical engineer. So we're talking about an engineer at the professional level in the field of mechanical engineering. Now, with the definition the Australian government uses, there's also a skill level. And the skill level states the minimum qualifications the person is required to have to be able to perform the work at a skilled level. And for a mechanical engineer, it's a bachelor degree or higher qualification. So what the government is effectively saying is only someone with a bachelor degree or higher would be considered appropriately qualified to work as a mechanical engineer. If you had just a diploma, you would not be qualified and not considered to be working or doing skilled work as a mechanical engineer. So you go off, you study your bachelor degree in engineering and you start working. Everything after your degree, provided the work, of course, is related to mechanical engineering, can be considered because it meets the skill level requirement for that occupation. But if you do a diploma in engineering and you start working, even if you're doing higher level responsibilities that would be on par with a mechanical engineer, we can't consider this work experience because you're not appropriately skilled. But if you did some part-time study and got yourself a bachelor degree in engineering, from the point onwards where you've got the bachelor degree, we can now consider that work experience. So this is quite a simple example, but to try and help people appreciate what's involved in determining if work is actually at the skilled level. It gets a bit more complex because in recent times, and this is really the last 2 years, we're starting to see occupations have skill levels that are not just a qualification, but a qualification and a certain amount of work experience. So what the government is saying is, we don't consider you appropriately qualified until you've also got some work experience as well as a qualification. And I've got some options here for ICT occupations. So these are basically programmers, analysts, system administrators, and so on. The minimum we're looking at is 2 years. And basically what this means is the government is saying as a package, they want to see that you've got a bachelor degree and at least 2 years of work experience as the base starting point before they consider you to be skilled. So that means only work experience after that 2 years can be considered. So if you had 8 years of experience, effectively 2 years is going to be deducted from that, and they only consider you to be skilled for the last 6 years of that 8 years experience. So you can only claim points for 6 years, not 8 years. Now, there are different options under ICT where even more years can be deducted. And we're starting to see this for other occupations as well. Science roles, business roles, marketing, advertising, a few other roles now also have a similar scheme where a certain number of years are deducted from your work experience. Can get quite complex. Now, you can also get points for your partner. If your partner meets certain requirements, you can get an extra 5 points. And your partner needs to meet 3 requirements. They must have a successful skill assessment for an occupation. They must have an IELTS score of at least 6 in each band, and they must be aged under 30. Now with the IELTS, I do mention here no IELTS exemption. And what I'm talking about here is that although you as a main applicant will need to go and do the IELTS test, your spouse may be exempted from the IELTS if they've got evidence of doing full-time study in English. Now, if they are claiming partner points, they're not eligible for that exemption of the IELTS. They must go and do the IELTS test. So just be aware of that. Always check with us before you go and book the IELTS test just to make sure it is necessary in your case, and we can discuss that. But if you are claiming partner points, then your partner will need to do the IELTS test to meet the requirements. Okay, so that's some of the key points. Let's talk about the actual process and steps involved in making a skilled migration application. So the skill assessment is required at the beginning of the process, and that's where that authority in Australia confirms you meet the requirements for that occupation. For most people, would recommend that they go and do or start the skill assessment first, And while that's in process, and it normally takes about 3 months to process, they go off and do the IELTS test. So they do it concurrently. That's just to save time, because if you go and do the IELTS test first, and you're only going to start the other process steps, like the skill assessment, when you've got the IELTS test back, then you're delaying the whole process. So it's more efficient to do these concurrently. Once the skill assessment and IELTS are complete, then we can look at lodging an expression of interest. Now, this is not yet a visa application. It's a preliminary step we have to do before we apply for the visa. And basically, what it involves is submitting information to the Australian government. It goes into a computerized database, and they will look at pulling people out of that database and inviting them to go ahead and apply for a visa. Now, there's 2 ways to get that invitation to basically be selected from the EOI database. First one is by getting nomination by the state or territory government. So if a state or territory government agrees to nominate you, then you'll be selected from that database and get an invitation to go ahead and make your visa application. The second way is your applications your EOIs are ranked by points, and there are selections made with places going to the people with the highest points first. And this is done twice a month. Of course, that second option, the ranking by points, is only available to people that don't require state nomination to get through the process. Because if you need state nomination, then you've got to apply for the state nomination and you're dependent upon getting that. So there's 2 ways basically to be selected from the EOI and go on to the visa application: by points or by nomination. And the nomination, as I mentioned before, is required for those people that have an occupation that is only on that lower demand list. Okay, so the EOI system gives you points, and later on when you make the visa application, you'll have an officer go through and review all the evidence and also allocate points to you based upon all the information demonstrated and proved in that evidence. So the EOI doesn't actually require any documents to be submitted. It's just based upon information that you put into the system. So if these all match up, so you do the EOI, get selected, later on do the visa application, and you've got the same number of points, everything's great, everything's fine. You do your EOI, and later on, it may be that the evidence shows you're actually entitled for more points. Not an issue. But if the reverse happens, then it's quite a problem. So if your EOI submission indicates that you have a certain number of points, and you don't get to choose the points, the system calculates the points automatically based upon the information you enter. And later, under the visa application, when the officer looks at all the evidence and documents, they decide that you're entitled to less points, so the points have gone down, then your application must fail. It must be refused. There's a rule that says if the visa application has less points, then it must be refused. So very important to be aware of this, and this can happen quite innocently. We talked before about situations where you're not actually entitled to claim all of the employment that you may have. Unfortunately, the EOI system's not smart enough to take into account factors like that. So if you've got 8 years of experience and you put that into the EOI database, so actually the EOI system will actually ask for the date you started your work. So if you said I started my job in 2007 and therefore I've got 8 years of experience, it will automatically give you 8 years in terms of points. Now, the visa application, the officer will look at this and say, well, under policy, you're not entitled to claim the full 8 years because of a particular rule. Therefore, I can't consider the first 2 years of your experience. So I'll consider your work to actually have started in 2009, not 2007. So your points now drop down to 10 points when they would have been 15 before, because you've only got 6 years you can claim. It can get quite complex. But basically, the EOI system is not smart enough to take into account all of these policies, but the visa officers will. So you have to be very, very careful. It's quite possible to actually innocently enter correct information and have your application fail because you entered correct information. So we actually have to do strange things, like with the EOI, we have to put an incorrect date. And rather than say you started in 2007, we have to put your start date of your employment as 2009. Otherwise, the system won't calculate the points correctly. That's a horrible situation, because one of the things you're declaring in the EOI is that all the information has been entered correctly. Well, it hasn't. We've had to put an incorrect date. But if we don't do that, you'll fail. Now, it's stupid in some ways, and I've raised this with the Immigration Department, and they're aware of it. But unfortunately, they can't do anything yet. They're still trying to work out a strategy to fix this. But I do expect it to be a long time because they'll have to do some more complex programming in the EOI system to really cover these sorts of situations. Okay, so as I said before, EOI can be selected by two ways. One is by points to get that invitation to do a visa. The other way is through state nomination. Now, state nomination is where those states and territories in Australia indicate that your skills are needed and they agree to support your application process. They will have stipulated requirements. So each state and territory will have a list of occupations they're looking for and a list of requirements for those occupations. For example, I know in Victoria, they're looking for secondary school teachers, but they want secondary school teachers with certain subject specializations that would include subjects like mathematics. So there are certain requirements that are needed for states to consider. Some states may want to see a higher English language score than is actually required for the visa process. So there are additional requirements. And the quotas for these are reset from the 1st of July each year. Although I have to point out the states often don't have everything organized to actually process new occupations from 1st of July. Often there's some delay before they can actually do that. And those delays can be up to 6 months sometimes before they actually get properly set up for the new program year from the 1st of July. So there can be some delay there. Now, if you're in a situation where you need the state nomination, then what we're looking at is this kind of flow here. It's very simplified, but basically skill assessment, then you get your nomination, and then you can apply for the visa. And skill assessment's usually about 3 months. State nomination varies depending upon the particular state, and then you apply for the visa. Now, you obviously need to have the state still agreeing to sponsor or nominate, I should say, your occupation for you to apply for that nomination. So if the nomination is available for the whole process, everything's fine. But sometimes you'll see, well, my occupation is available for nomination. So you start the skill assessment process, you go through the skill assessment, and you get the results 3 months later. And at that point of time, 3 months later, when you've got the skill assessment results, it may be that the nomination has disappeared, that all the places have been filled up, and that state's taken that occupation off their list. It does happen, particularly for occupations that don't have many nomination options, and there's a high demand for those limited places available. So this is one of the challenging things, because a lot of people will come to us and say, look, you know, I want to do this process, but I want you to give me confirmation there's a pathway available for me now for me to start this process. Now, just because there's a pathway available now doesn't mean the pathway will be available in 3 months' time. And the reverse also, just because there's no option now doesn't mean there won't be an option in 3 months' time. So it's quite a challenge. And just because something exists or doesn't exist now doesn't mean it'll be the same situation in the near future. So the other approach is, let's say you've got an occupation that needs state nomination and there's no nomination available. Should you wait until nomination becomes available, or should you go ahead now? My opinion would be that if you want the greatest chance of success, then you would go ahead with the skill assessment now. So even though your nomination is not available, you go ahead and do the skill assessment now, so you then got that skill assessment in hand. Now, what that means is you would wait, and you'd wait until your nomination becomes available. As soon as it becomes available, you can immediately apply for that nomination. What that means is, with a high demand nomination where there's you expect a high demand for that because there's not many states nominating that occupation, you expect it to go very quickly. It means that you can be first off the rank because you can apply immediately when it's available. The alternative would be that when that nomination becomes available, you then start your skill assessment, and then you're looking at this previous pathway, and a very high risk that by the time you finish the skill assessment, that nomination is no longer available. There are risks either way. For example, this way you are paying fees ahead of time without any guarantee that you're going to get through the process. But also in this way, you're also risking a fee because you go ahead with a skill assessment and you expect that nomination not to be available very long, and it may be gone before you finish the skill assessment. So this is what I'd recommend. But of course, you have to apply some common sense. If it's an occupation that we don't see nominated, then I probably wouldn't recommend going ahead and doing the skill assessment, because the risk could be much, much higher. But there are several occupations that we know are very likely to appear each year. It's just that they don't last very long, and they'd be prime candidates for an approach like this, depending upon what the client chooses to do. Okay, so you get your EOI selection, you get the invitation, you can then go ahead and lodge the visa application. Now, the visa application requires evidence to support every claim that you've made. For example, your age, you need your birth certificate to show that. For your work experience, you need to have evidence that you've got the required work experience. And for work experience, it's not just having a certificate of service saying that you're a great guy and you've been doing this occupation for the last 5 years. We need evidence of the specific duties and responsibilities. So it's not just having a letter saying Joe Bloggs is a programmer. We need a letter that says Joe Bloggs has been developing software code, writing technical documentation, participating in user acceptance testing. You know, spelling out those duties and responsibilities the government expects would make up that kind of role. The work has to be full-time, and that's at least 20 hours per week by definition we use. So what you might consider to be part-time might actually be full-time by the Australian government's definition. And we need other supporting evidence for that employment as well. Now, most people don't have a detailed reference letter that goes into their various tasks or responsibilities. We recommend that you don't run off now and get that. Wait till you start the process with us, and we'll actually help you draw up a template to make sure the right information is included for your job in that template. You're not missing out anything important in that. The other interesting thing to note is that your recent employment experience isn't necessarily required. And what's actually happened is the Australian government has abolished the requirement to have recent work experience. So previously there was a requirement that you had to have evidence of recent work experience in the role. Well, that has been removed. And what this means is basically you may be able to get through the process without having any evidence from your current job, because I know it's very difficult to go to your current employer and say, hey boss, I'm going to leave you and go to Australia. Can you sign off this letter to help me with that process? So this is very, very handy because for many people it means they don't have to have that kind of conversation with their boss. They're able to do this process without including evidence from the current employment. Now, during the visa process, you'll be required to undergo medical and character checks. So the medical and character checks are, well, for the medical, will include a basic medical examination, HIV test, chest x-ray. The thing the Australian government does with this is they're weighing up what's the cost going to be to have you in Australia versus the economic benefits that you bring. Obviously, if everyone migrating to Australia had very serious medical conditions, when they get to Australia, they get free public healthcare. So any of the healthcare costs are actually the responsibility and liability of the Australian government. So if it was very high, then the government would be up for very high costs to support the immigration process. So they've drawn a benchmark. And the benchmark they use is $40,000 over 5 years. And what this basically means is if you've got a medical condition, but the expected medical costs are likely to be below $40,000 over a 5-year period, then it's likely to not be an issue and you can actually pass the medical checks for skilled migration to Australia. I am simplifying it. There are a few more details to it, but essentially it comes down to that cost estimation. And what this means is that you can have quite a significant health condition, but if the expected medical costs are on the lower side, that is below $40,000 over a 5-year period, then you're likely to be able to get through the medical requirements. So we have clients that have hypertension, we have clients with diabetes, clients that are Hep B carriers, We have clients with a lot of medical conditions that are successful in this process. The important thing here is that if you do have a medical condition, or any of your other family members that are in the application too, then let us know and give us some details, and I can give you an idea of whether or not it's likely to be a problem for the visa process. Character checks are basically police criminal history checks, and these are showing that you don't have any significant criminal record. Note that I say significant criminal record or criminal history. You can have minor incidents and still get through this process. So it's like the medicals, if there are any criminal issues, let me know up front, and I can let you know whether or not it's likely to be an issue that would impact the process. Processing times roughly are on the screen here. Skill assessment, expression of interest, state nomination, and the visa application. Visa application, typically we see about 3 months, but at the moment there's a bit of an internal delay with just work queues, so a bit of a backlog there. So in some cases it can be an extra 5 months or so. These are estimates. They can vary. Sometimes it may be longer, sometimes it may be shorter. These are approximate estimates for the process. Okay, so you get through this process, you get your PR, you go down to Australia, and you've got your PR in your hand. Now, although people think of permanent residence as being permanent, there are 2 aspects, and only one of these is permanent. So PR gives you 2 benefits. The first one is the right to live in Australia, and that's the one that's permanent. So you've got the right to live in Australia indefinitely. There's no expiry for your right to stay on in Australia. The other aspect is your right to travel, and that has a fixed validity. So your right to travel to Australia is valid for 5 years. So if you're in Australia, you can live there as long as you like, but if you leave Australia and want to travel back, that travel right to re-enter Australia is only valid for a 5-year period. So after 5 years, if you leave Australia, you can't get back into Australia as a PR. Now, to renew those travel rights, it's quite easy. If you want to renew for another 5 years, there's only one way, and that's to be physically in Australia for a total of 24 months, that's 2 years, in Australia to qualify to renew for another 5 years. So it's the only way to renew for another 5 years. Now, previously there were other options, but a fairly recent change has been to change this so that you must have 24 months in Australia during the last 5 years to apply for a further 5 years. And that applies to each person in your family unit. So that's the only way. Now, it is possible to renew for a 1-year period, not 5 years, but a 1-year period based upon other pathways. For example, strong ties to Australia. But these are becoming more and more difficult, and they will give you a maximum of 1 year only. So do target the 2 years in Australia. So for most people, I'd recommend that after the visa is granted, you plan to move to Australia within 3 years. But there may be some other strategies to approach this a bit more tricky. So do talk to me about that if you need to work out some sort of plan, and I can help you with some information on that. Regarding the ties to Australia, they can give you the 1 year without being in Australia. They are very difficult. Things like owning a property in Australia, having a bank account in Australia, having relatives in Australia are very, very, very unlikely to qualify as ties to Australia that are considered substantial enough for this criteria. What we'd be looking at would be things like you working for an Australian company that requires you to be working overseas, or you operating a company in Australia and managing that company on a day-to-day basis. So these are the sorts of things we'd consider under this. Now, a little extra perk of having PR in Australia. PR in Australia gives you residency in New Zealand. So if you've got a PR in Australia and travel to New Zealand, on arrival at the airport in New Zealand, just show them that you've got the Australian PR and you will get residency in New Zealand, which means you can live, work, study in New Zealand. Unfortunately, the reverse is not true. If you've got residency in New Zealand, it doesn't give you any right to travel to Australia or live or work in Australia. So this is one way only. But what this basically means is when you apply for Australia, you're also getting New Zealand in the package for no extra cost. So you actually have the right to live and work in both countries So it's quite useful benefit. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an idea of skilled migration and what's involved in the skilled migration process. Just a few other points I'll just touch upon. As far as we go, ANZ Migration in Singapore, we're one of the few agencies in Singapore that's actually managed by a registered migration agent. So the company is owned and managed by myself as a registered migration agent, and my fellow registered agent, Wilson, is a director of the company. So we're actually in charge of the company. Now, what that means is that we're fully accountable for what happens in the company. The majority of agents in Singapore are not actually registered. So very, very important to be aware of that. And a lot of agents out there that will blatantly lie to you and deceive you into thinking they are registered or more qualified than they actually are. We do a lot of things to protect our clients. For example, we have indemnity insurance. This provides claims of up to $1 million for our clients. Now, we don't expect to ever use this, but it's there because we consider that important just in case something went wrong. So if something went wrong and clients suffered a loss, there is that insurance there to protect them. As I said, we don't expect to ever use it, but it's there that will give our clients some peace of mind that if something went wrong, there is protection available. Now, if you are looking at choosing an agent, a couple of tips and suggestions. Of course, make sure you are dealing with a registered migration agent. Most agents in Singapore are not registered, and quite often you'll look up a company's detail on the agent register and you'll see the company name there and you'll see the agent that's registered in that company. But when you go down to that company, you talk to someone else, not that agent. So be very careful. Only the registered agent can provide advice, and there's no registration for companies. So make sure you are dealing with that registered agent in that company. Ask questions. I think this is very important. Ask questions. Make sure the person is able to answer your questions and willing to answer the questions. We know of some of these agents in Singapore that are quite evasive because they either don't know the answers to the questions, or maybe they don't want to tell you the truth. Maybe you're not eligible, but they're going to mislead you. And that's happened as well. We've had people come to us that have gone to other agents where they're not actually eligible, but the agent has lied to them and told them they are, and not fully answered or correctly answered the questions that would have indicated they're not eligible. Expect an open and clear cost breakdown. One of the things we've started doing is when we've assessed you as eligible, straight away we'll email you a quote that will indicate all of the costs, both our fees and government fees and other external charges. So once we've assessed you, we're able to provide that immediately. We don't charge for that. It's provided free of charge without obligation. And you know upfront what you're looking at for costs of the process. So it's completely transparent. Some agencies here in Singapore won't even tell you what the costs are until you actually pay them for further analysis and further checking before they'll actually indicate what the costs are for the process. And one of the agencies in particular that does this charges nearly double our fee, and they're not managed by a registered migration agent, even though they appear to be. So you need to be very, very careful. There's a lot of misunderstanding and dishonesty, unfortunately, in the industry. And don't be pressured into signing. If someone's pressuring you, saying, you know, you've got to sign now, if you don't sign now, there's going to be implications, then you know you're not dealing with a registered agent, because we're not allowed to pressure clients and apply pressure to get clients to sign the contract. So how do we help? Well, we help with all aspects of the process. We are a full service agency, so that means not only, of course, checking at the beginning to determine if you're eligible or not. And of course, if you're not eligible, we'll tell you so. We're not going to beat around the bush. So if you're not eligible, I'll be upfront and tell you. I'm not going to lead you on in any way. Making sure everything's done correctly, making sure that everything is done completely, managing complex issues if they come up, identifying mistakes made by the department. Now, DIBP is the immigration department, and they do make mistakes. I've had a couple of mistakes over the last year where the department has refused applications when they shouldn't have. Everything was correct, everything was correctly done, and the processing officer made a mistake and refused the application. And all of those cases, I've been successful in overturning those, challenging them, and getting those mistakes overturned. Now, sometimes it takes a while. I had one case that was refused in April last year that, again, shouldn't, of course, been refused. And I challenged the department. They kept insisting they did things correctly. I had to escalate it. I had to take it to the assistant director of skilled migration, and it was overturned, but it took about 8-9 months to get that final decision to overturn the application. Now, these, I would like to say, are rare, but unfortunately, we do see a lot of mistakes made by the department. And it's important that someone like myself is overseeing the application to really look out and identify where these are incorrectly done and correct those case officers. And really on that advocate for the process. So I'm prepared to stand up and challenge the department and represent you and fight for your case if that's required. So how we're different? Well, owned and managed by a registered migration agent based in Singapore, and we're quite honest and professional in our advice. I mean, this is my company. I'm proud of what we do, and therefore I make sure that our company does the right thing by our clients. We're a small company, so there's no GST applicable on our fees, so we're able to operate legally without charging GST because we are a small company. And we don't have any hidden additional charges. So when we give you that cost breakdown, you are seeing the full costs. And there are a lot of things we do that are free of charge. For example, anytime we send documents to Australia, we send them by courier services, and we don't charge for that. We believe that's our responsibility, and we use couriers because even though the postal service would be cheaper, it's not as reliable and it's slower. So we do these things really to protect our clients' interests and make sure everything is done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So if you are interested, you can complete the assessment form, which is on our website. It is a free assessment, and that will let me go through and determine if you're eligible. Now, our skill assessment form is aimed towards skilled migration. So if you are looking at some other pathway, do send me an email and I can give you an indication of what other options may be available to you. And of course, once we've done the the free assessment, we'll determine what options are available to you and send you an email listing those options and the costs for them. Okay, so that's covered it for what I wanted to cover in the presentation today. There is a question section at the bottom of the screen, which you're very welcome to go to and type any questions you have there. I noticed there's some questions already that have come through, but do type any questions you have, and I'll try and get through all of those questions today. If there's questions that I don't have time to get through, or maybe it's a bit private, you don't want to discuss it in a public forum like this, then do send me an email. The address is on the screen, and I'm very happy to actually go through and come back to you via email to help answer that question. Also, I do encourage you to ask general questions. I mean, this is not the appropriate place to ask specific case questions specific to your application. I do ask general questions, and I'm more than happy to answer those. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. So let's actually, if I just get things going here. Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, just give me a moment to look at the questions we have, and we'll be able to go through those. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay, let's have a look what we've got. Okay, so first question is from Jazz, and the question is, if my job is listed on the skilled nominated list, does it mean that I'm able to submit an EOI? What are the conditions to be able to qualify for skilled nominated permanent subclass 190? Okay, so you've got two questions here. So if your job is listed on the skilled nominated list, I assume by that you mean the list the state has. So the state will have its list of occupations that it will consider nominating. I'm assuming here that you're referring to that actual list. Well, does it mean you're able to submit an OI? Well, there are other requirements as well. No, if it's just because it's listed there doesn't mean you're eligible or not eligible. There are other requirements. But to get that nomination from the state, then yes, your occupation must be on that list. And what are the conditions to be able to qualify for skilled nominated permanent subclass 190? Well, there's a lot of requirements to be able to qualify. Too many to list here. But the key things are that you've got to have an occupation, and that occupation must be nominated by a state or territory government to actually get through the process. So Imam's got a question. If my skills select, so you mean expression of interest, EOI is approved, how long can it last? Oh, you mean, I'm not sure if you mean skill assessment or skill EOI. If you mean assessment, they do vary, usually between 1 to 3 years in terms of validity. For example, you put primary school teacher quota is filled for this year. Yes, so you will, for most skill assessments, be able to apply in the following year if your quota was filled up. But it will vary depending upon the occupation. But in most cases, yes, you'll be able to wait and look at the next program year if the quota was filled up in this current year. Also, your IELTS test is valid for 3 years, so that can also be used as well. Jazz asks, what's the difference between the 190, which is skilled nominated, and skilled regional provisional, subclass 489? Well, the key difference is the 489 is a temporary visa that requires you to live and work in Australia live there for 2 years and work for 1 year before you can then qualify for the PR. Whereas the nominated visa, the 190, is direct PR. So that's the key difference. The other thing is the temporary visa under the 489 limits where you can live in Australia while you're on that temporary visa. So the other key differences between those two. Srinivasu asks, what is experience required if you've got a non-ICT qualification, but you're working in ICT? So you've got a bachelor degree in business management, but you're working in the ICT field. Well, ICT is interesting because with ICT, they recognize that many people in ICT occupations don't have an ICT qualification and they develop their skills on the job. So if you've got a bachelor degree in a different field, but you're working in ICT, then you would need to have 6 years of experience minimum to get a skill assessment as an ICT occupation. Jazz asks a question, how and where to get state nomination? What's the process like? Well, how do you get it? Well, the states will actually have lists of their requirements and what they're seeking. So they have the occupations they're seeking, any other requirements. You would submit an application to that state showing that you've got the skill assessment, showing your IELTS and any other requirements are met. They'll then consider that and after a period of time, indicate whether or not they're going to grant or refuse that nomination. That's how it is for most states. Some states, in particular New South Wales and Western Australia, which is where Perth is, so where Perth and Sydney are, those states, they're doing a little bit different process. They will actually look at the EOI database, and from the EOI database, they will identify suitable candidates and then come back to you and say, we'd like to invite you to apply for nomination. You then apply to that state. Now, they will have additional requirements you have to meet, so it's not based upon just upon the information of the EOI. There will be other requirements as well. If you meet all those requirements, then again, they grant the nomination. You can then go ahead with the actual visa process. And Mia's got a question. You submitted a free assessment together with your wife, but no response received. I will check on that for you. I've got your email address here. Do allow a few days after you submit the assessment because they are manually done. They're not automated, so I do have to look through those and determine and check everything out and determine if you're eligible. Sometimes we do find the results end up in spam or junk mail, so do check your junk mail folder. But if it didn't get through, then I'll resend that. So we'll look at that after the webinar and make sure those results are sent through. If you don't get any results within the next day or so, do let me know and I can give you a ring or try sending again those emails. Okay, so that looks like all the questions we've got. If there's no more questions, then I'll wrap up for today. So just give me a moment. I'll just check our list. Oh, great. Okay, well, that's good. It means that I've answered everyone's questions, and it means that you've understood what I've talked about. So hopefully this has been a good experience for you to actually learn more about skilled migration. Any other questions you have, you're quite welcome to send them through. I'll just put our email address again on the screen. And I'll just do that. Email address is on the screen there. If you have any questions, send them through. If there's anything else I can help you with, send them through. I'm more than happy to answer. If you haven't filled out the skill assessment, please do so. You can see a link at the bottom of the screen, which is, well, where are we? Down there somewhere. There's a link there for the skill assessment on the left-hand side, the bottom of the screen. Or you can go to anzmigrate.com and fill out the assessment form there. Give us a few days and we'll come back to you with the results of that assessment. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. And I look forward to helping you in the near future. Thanks again. Bye-bye.